Hello everyone, this is Dr. Rivera again. In this video, I'm still talking about chapter 1, but I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics, a little bit about the history of psychology, and a little bit about modern psychology and career paths. Now, obviously, when researchers are conducting research or doing studies, they must behave properly, they must be ethical. Now, I say obviously, but in reality, uh, there are a lot of rules about how to do things because in the past, a lot of people have done them wrong. And uh, subjects have suffered and patients have suffered because people did not take the time to do things ethically, um, to consider the lives of their subjects, of their patients, how they might suffer, etc. Today, um, if you're going to do research, there will be a committee that will make certain decisions for you regarding ethics. And specifically, there will sometimes be a what we call an IRB, an institutional review board, or a human research ethics committee, which will determine if your research is ethical and if you are allowed to deal with people, to deal with animals. They will be even more strict if you're dealing with a population that has been known to kind of suffer uh, in the past. People with mental disabilities, um, people with cognitive disabilities, people with that are dealing with disease, um, older people, children. And so, uh, especially with those kind of special groups, they are going to be even more strict. But with anybody, you have to go through your IRB before you're even allowed to talk to someone. Um, and if you don't, then I mean, a lot of times you can get fired. If you're a researcher, you could be thrown out of the school. If you are a student, things like that. There are a few things that we focus on. Ethics is much more complex than following a couple of rules, but there are some rules that are a must. One of them is informed consent, which means the subject needs to know what you're going to do to them. And it's not enough just that they know, they have to consent to what you are telling them. Uh, Also, in the past, people would be given like a page that they would have to sign off on. And of course, people didn't read it. That's not informed consent. That's not ethically allowed in psychology and in a lot of other fields. But it is allowed in some other fields, unfortunately. But if you're going to do psychological research, the person has to be informed. It's not enough that you give them the ability to be informed with a piece of paper. You have to tell them, and they have to understand. For example, let's say that you are going to do research on someone who has a cognitive disability. They have a mental handicap and they have a hard time understanding things. Well, you can't just explain it the way you would explain it to anybody else. You have to explain it in a way that they understand, and then they must give consent. Also, no matter whether they gave consent or not, people have a right to withdraw for any reason at any time. So maybe they went through half of the experiment or the study and they decided that, like, no, I'm not going to do this. And maybe they have a good reason. It's triggering some difficult time or some stress, or maybe they don't have a good reason. They just decided that they don't want to do it anymore. Well, that has nothing to do with you. You don't get to tell them that they have to complete a study. That is completely within their right, and it's not okay. It would be unethical for you to try to convince them otherwise. Um, you also have to protect people's confidentiality. If someone is giving you information for your study, maybe they have been unfaithful to their husband or wife. Maybe they're telling you about some disorder or a disease that they have. Maybe they're telling you about where they work. Well, all of that information is confidential. They're giving it to you because you asked, and so now it's your responsibility to keep it a secret and protect it. Of course, in the past, people have not done this. And so, let's say somebody found out that a subject had a mental disorder and they got fired. Something that used to happen often was, a family member found out someone was gay or lesbian, and they would get ostracized by their family, by their job, by their community. Um, it is not okay to reveal something that people have told you in confidence. And therefore, once you have that information, you are required to and ethically bound to protect that confidentiality. Um, there are some studies that require deception. They require for you to lie. Because if you tell the participant the what's going to happen, then it would ruin the experiment. Well, that's okay so long as you get approval from your IRB, from your committee. And they're only going to give you approval if the reason you're lying is relevant to the study, number one, and number two, relevant to the field of psychology or the field of study that you're doing. Um, then, even though you're allowed to lie to this person now, you are required to debrief them afterwards, to tell them what happened and why it happened. Um, because sometimes you lie to them and they go home and they think that whatever happened in that study really did happen. And that could cause a lot of stress and pain for this person. Some examples of psychological studies that were completely unethical and would never be allowed today are things like Milgram's experiment on authority. In Milgram's experiment on authority, somebody would come in and they were told that they were going to help teach someone um, by asking them some questions, and you were going to test how well uh, punishment made people learn something. That was a lie. You weren't really doing that. The person that you were told was a student was really just an actor. And when you came in and they got a question wrong, you were asked to give them an electric shock. And at first, the electric shock was gentle, was not too strong, but every time they got a question wrong, the electrical shock was harder. Of course, all of this was a lie. No one was getting shocked. The actor was just screaming, he was just acting. And uh, the the actor would say things like, "Get me out of here, this really hurts," or "I have a heart condition." Um, and the subjects would often stop and say, "Who's going to be responsible for this? That guy seems to be really hurt." At one point, the actor would stop giving responses, pretending like they had passed out. And there was usually another actor playing the part of a scientist. And this actor was wearing a lab coat, and usually they had like a clipboard, and the scientist would say, um, "You are required to continue," or uh, "A wrong answer requires a shock," or "No answer is the same as a wrong answer. So please shock the subject." And what they were testing was, would people continue to shock this individual even though they might kill them? And of course, most people did continue to shock the individual because, as we now know, authority tends to get to, tends to push us to do things that we really wouldn't want to do. Now, the reason I bring up Milgram is because these individuals thought they had killed someone. And when they saw the actor fine at the end, they were incredibly relieved. Sometimes they hugged the actor because they really had thought they had killed him. And then, of course, if they had been left to go home, then that would have been they might have thought their whole life that they had killed somebody if they hadn't been debriefed. So again, this is a somewhat unethical study in general. Even with the debriefing, is putting the subjects through a lot of emotional trauma. In the Stanford prison experiment, uh, young people, yeah, around college age people, boys specifically, were put into a make believe jail, and then some other boys were randomly assigned to be guards. And it didn't take that long before the guards started to abuse the prisoners. Mind you, they weren't real guards, they weren't real prisoners, but the guards or the students that were acting like guards began to abuse the prisoners. And again, this is something that is unethical. I don't think anybody would allow a study like this to continue, specifically because they didn't really consent. These boys were kind of told that they were going to do a study for prison, and they didn't consent to be mistreated. Um, and when the guards started to mistreat them, it wasn't stopped. It, it was allowed, or the mistreatment was allowed to continue for quite a while. Also, some of the kids would, when their parents came to visit them, would say things like "You have to get me out of here," and technically speaking, they could have just walked away because there was no one actually stopping them. But the roles have become so real to them that they didn't. They just accepted that they were prisoners there. Um, in a study today, as soon as someone suggested that they wanted to leave, it would be unethical for you to leave them there. But these kids were forced to stay until they essentially started having panic attacks. And at that point, after a few of them had panic attacks, they were eventually stopped. Um, um, Frontal lobe lobotomies were something that were done for quite a while, decades really. In a frontal lobe lobotomy, a portion of your frontal lobe was taken out of your brain as a treatment for, some social issues, like a lady who wanted to wear pants instead of dresses. Uh, no one gives informed consent to have their brain taken out. Um, and that would be completely unacceptable today as a treatment, specifically because it doesn't work to make this person's life better. It actually destroys their life. Um, and of course, we'll talk a little bit more about little Albert when we talk about learning. But little Albert was a little kid, and they gave him a phobia. They classically conditioned a phobia into little Albert. Little Albert was too young to consent, number one. And number two, they didn't even try to take the phobia away. After they gave him the phobia, they just sent him back home, or more specifically, back to the hospital where they had gotten him. So, all throughout history, there's a lot of stories of unethical behavior by researchers um, in psychology and in other fields as well. But today we have a lot of rules about how to keep track of ethics and what is considered ethical or not. When it comes to animals, there are a lot of laws that protect many animals. Unfortunately, very few of those laws protect rats, and so rats tend to get the brunt of um, uh, medical research and neurological research, etc. And we learned a lot from studying rats and studying animals. There are a lot of people who are against animal research for very real reasons. What you're looking at there is a rat. This rat has a hole in their skull, and those are two electrodes going into their brain. Obviously, this rat is not going to live the kind of life it would have lived if it wasn't a research lab. Um, and so people see this and they have a real problem with it. You still need IRB approval for uh, rats and for other animals because there's still ethical issues. But obviously, they're going to be a little bit more laxed than for humans. And as I mentioned, poor rats tend to have the most laxed rules. If you're going to do research on a primate or even like a dog, there are a lot of rules and a lot of laws that protect them. But some research, if you've done research on mice, if you've done research on other rodents, you moved up the ladder to maybe cats and then eventually dogs or apes. Um, uh, Eventually that research might get to a chimp or something like that. There are a lot of rules that protect animals like chimps, but still, there's a lot of research that is done on chimps. And oftentimes, after the research is done, the chimp is euthanized, is killed, their brain is taken out and sliced up into little hams so that they can be observed under a microscope, things like that. And so obviously people do have a lot of emotion about treating animals that way. All right, guys, I want to take a few moments to talk a little bit about uh, the history of psychology as a science. I mentioned earlier in the first video that before around the 1800s, psychology was specifically part of the philosophies. If you go back far enough into history, psychology was just part of the mythologies of the world. People would say, what makes somebody crazy? The gods. How come some people are successful? Fate, things like that. How come some people are creative? The muses come to visit them. They were just part of the mythologies. But eventually, psychology becomes part of the philosophies, and for most of human history, psychology, or I should say, written history, the part that we know about, psychology was part of the philosophies. And, we learn a lot really from the philosophers. They weren't always right, but they were right a lot. And we still use some philosophical ideas even today, or I should say, ideas that came from the philosophers. We still consider them to be true today. Not all of them. Philosophers believed at one point that every human had four liquids in them: blood, mucus, black bile, and yellow bile. And your personality was dependent on how much you had of each of those liquids. So if you are a very fiery person, someone who's quick to anger and very passionate or emotional, um, you had too much blood in you. And someone who was kind of nerdy, pragmatic, and shy, then that person had too much mucus in them. And so, if you wanted your kid to be less nerdy, then you had to get them to blow their nose more, get that mucus out of them. And if you were too fiery, then, to get you back to normal, then they would have to bleed you. And they'd let you bleed for a little while so that you weren't as hot headed. And you weren't, because you were dying, because they were bleeding you, literally. Obviously, those things were just false. That has nothing to do with real psychology, or at least scientific psychology. Although literature often uses some of those ideas, the for humor ideas. Um, but it's around the 1800s when psychology first starts being studied as a science. I'd like to point out that for a long time, people thought that you could never study psychology as a science. Why? Because I can't see what's happening in the brain. There's no way to observe it. And it's not until the physiologists come around that they start to uh, study psychology in a real scientific way. So, what are they doing? Well, the gentleman you're seeing up there is Bell. And Bell is one of the first researchers to realize that your nerves go in one of two directions. Some of your nerves start in your brain and they go down to your body. That is, they send signals from your brain to your body. And some of your nerves go the opposite way. They start in the body and they go to the brain. That is, they send signals from the body to the brain. And that might seem very unimportant, but it is how all of a sudden, when you realize that, you understand that there is a mechanism to get information from outside of the world into the body. That is, let's say from the eyes to the brain, from your hand to your brain, and the opposite, from your brain to your body, so you can move. Um, Before that, people knew that there were nerves, right, all the way down to Galen in ancient Rome. But it's not until Bell in the late 1800s where we find the mechanism for how that works. And the physiologists did a lot of what today you would consider somewhat silly studies. They were very important, but you know, it's hard for us to read about them and be super interested. They would be things like if when you felt a feather touch your finger, your let's say your left finger, you would have to hit a button with your right finger, and they would measure how long that would take between feeling the feather to you hitting the button. Um, there were just a lot of things like that, those kind of studies. These are the physiologists. Now, Wundt and Titchener are doing studies that are a little bit more like what we would consider psychology, or at least modern psychology. Um, they're still not quite modern psychology. Uh, Wundt and Titchener are part of a field that we call structuralism because they were interested in the structures of the mind, not the structures of the brain, not this part of the brain does this and that part of the brain does that. When we will talk about that, but that's not really what Wundt and Titchener were looking for. They were looking for the structures of the mind. And that is, how is your mind, or the way your mind works, similar to the way that my mind works? What are the structures that are always going to be there? And there really are structures, which we will also discuss. The problem with Wundt and Titchener was that they were really into a specific type of study that is called introspection. In introspection, they would ask you how you feel, or how something makes you feel, or they would have you do a specific task and ask you, you know, what you thought about it, and how you felt at the moment, things like that. A good example is they might put your hand in a box and have you feel something, and then they'll ask you what it feels like, or how that. what kind of emotions it brings up. And there's a big problem with introspection, which is depending on who you are, you're going to get different feelings from that, right? Maybe you put your hand in a box and you feel something gooey and you go, oh, that's gross. It feels like slime or mold or something like that. And maybe I put my hand in there and I go, oh, it feels like pudding because that's the, I know what pudding feels like for some reason. And my life experiences now change my version of introspection. But not only that, from one moment to another, maybe the first time you put your hand in that box, you're like, ah, it's gross. But if you do it the next time, you're used to it. And so now it doesn't feel so gross and it changes the way you feel about it. So introspection is a very difficult tool to use. Um, but Wundt and Titchener were really into introspection. And if you happen to be one of their students and you wanted to do research on dogs, they would say, well, you can't do research on dogs. How are you going to ask them how they feel? Dogs can't talk. If you wanted to do research on children, they would have the same problem. How are you going to ask a child what they feel like, etc.? And so once Wundt and Titchener died or they left academic life, their school of psychology just died with them. Now, uh, kind of jump around a little bit. This is William James, and James was a functionalist. He was interested in how your mind allows you to function. That is, how is it that the things your mind does allow you to succeed, to do better, and to function into the real world? James was heavily influenced by evolution and Charles Darwin. The idea being, how did your mind evolve, and how did that evolution allow you to pass down more copies of your gene, and further, how does being functional in the world allow you to pass down those genes? Um, and it's James who first writes the first psychology textbook, and it's James who we consider the father of modern psychology. Um, James was much more open, and so if his students wanted to do studies with introspection, yeah, he was all about that. But also, if his students came up with other ways to do psychological research on animals, on children, etc., he was very open to that as well. And because of that, uh, James's school of psychology, functionalism, grows, and it evolves into behaviorism. Um, Now, I kind of mentioned behaviorism already, so let me talk about behaviorism. These two gentlemen at the top here, this is B.F. Skinner and Watson, John B. Watson, and they are behaviorists. Behaviorism kind of comes directly from functionalism, it just kind of evolves out of it. Behaviorists are interested in behavior to the point where behaviorists stop asking about what's happening in the animal's mind. They only care about behavior and how we can modify behavior, change a behavior in the way that we want. And so they it's through behaviorism that we get classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And if you've ever seen a chicken play the piano or, um, I don't know, a water skiing squirrel, it's behaviorism that those things occur through. Um, Now, on the other side of the Atlantic in Austria, Sigmund Freud is doing his own research. Freud was a medical doctor. He went to school to be a medical doctor, and he just happened to focus on the brain. But there's a problem with that is when you go to treat people that have, let's say, anxiety or depression, Um, uh, you can't treat. You can know everything there is to know about the brain. You can't treat them. Even today, that would be very difficult. And at least today we know how medicines work and which medicines might affect what parts of the brain, etc. In Freud's time, that kind of data just didn't exist yet. So what did Freud do? Freud went into all those years where psychology was part of the philosophies, and he pulled that out and he kind of mixed it with what he knew about the brain from his medical studies. And then he added a third thing, which was talk therapy. And it's through Freud that we get the idea of uh, the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. He pulled things like that um, from philosophies. Uh, the idea that you have a part of your mind that is very animalistic and another part of your mind that is sort of high thinking and wants to fit into society just right, right? Uh, he fits all of this in with his medical knowledge, and he creates what we call psychoanalysis. It's important to point out, and I'll bring this up again later, that the psychoanalysts and the behaviorists kind of hated each other. They had a rivalry, and they really believed that they were right and the other were completely wrong. So the psychoanalysts would say things like, these behaviorists, they're just playing with animals. People aren't robots, we're not animals. People are much more complex than that, and they believe that one day behaviorism will be proven as a fraud and psychoanalysis would rule forever. And the behaviorists thought the same thing. They thought these psychoanalysts are talking about an unconscious mind and an id, things you can't see and measure. They're just quacks, they're liars. And one day they're going to be proven as frauds, and behaviorism will be the real psychology forever. And of course, both of them were wrong. Uh, Both of them had important theories that we still use today that form the basis of modern psychology today. We get that from both psychoanalysis and behaviorism. And neither of them lasted um, forever. Today, no one is actually a behaviorist, no one is actually a psychoanalyst. Um, and that started to crack when humanistic psychology came around. This is towards the end of the 20th century, so 50s and 60s. Carl Roger comes around and he uh, starts talking about a type of psychology that's there to help people, not just to diagnose people and to see why how people have, you know, ego defense mechanisms or that their ids are too strong, etc. Uh, they are trying to figure out how do we help people? How do we get them to be better? How do we get them to grow? What is free will? What does a healthy personality look like? Um, and so humanist psychology was often called third force psychology because it was sort of um, uh, the third force, or the thing that separates behaviorism and psychoanalysis. And we'll talk a little bit more about humanistic psychology as well later on. Now, as I mentioned, today, no one is actually a functionalist or a behaviorist or a humanistic psychologist, even. Although humanistic psychology, there are some people who still sort of dabble in that. Um, Today, psychology is a lot more about the job you're going to do. And so the type of psychologist that you become is directly related to the job that you want to do. And so I just want to hit a few of these. Um, uh, in biopsychology, you're probably just a researcher. And one of the things that you are researching is the evolutionary changes of the biological processes, um, that underlie behavior. So, for example, you might study a specific neurotransmitter, dopamine. How do snakes use dopamine? How do dogs use dopamine? Is there a change? Is there a change in the receptor? Um, if we see that some animals use oxytocin specifically for lactation, but in social animals, we use it to bond emotionally with each other. Um, that change is interesting, right? And it's a biological change, but it directly relates to how we behave. That's something that a biopsychologist uh, would undertake. And if you're a biopsychologist that mainly focuses on humans, we also often call that an evolutionary psychologist, even though it's almost the same thing. When you focus on humans, they're often called evolutionary psychologists. Now, if you're a clinical psychologist, then you are likely dealing with people who have mental disorders. And you might do research, but you might also just be a therapist. Um, and you are trying to figure out why people have mental disorders, specifically this person in front of you, your patient, your client. Why does this person have this mental disorder? How can we help them overcome that? And if you do research and you're trying to figure out what works best for these kinds of people, this other kinds of people, etc. If you're a cognitive psychologist, you're also probably just a researcher and you're studying mental processes, how people think, how they make decisions, how they problem solve, under which circumstances, you know, are people going to be better at problem solving or decision making, etc. There's another field called um, behavioral economics, and that's very related to cognitive psychology. It focuses on problem solving, etc., but it takes the angle of how the environment affects all that. If you are doing community psychology, then you're probably dealing with communities, how people interact in societies and small groups and your neighborhood, your city. And again, you're mostly going to focus on early interventions for things like, let's say, graffiti or gang membership, or how do we get people to be more involved in social activities, things like that. If you're doing counseling psychology, again, you're probably more focused on therapy, and you're probably focusing on counseling, dealing with people who are having issues, probably not always mental disorders, but people who might be having a hard time with, let's say, divorce or changing schools, or you witness some traumatic experience. So a counselor or someone in counseling psychology would focus more on that. In cross cultural psychology, this person is going to focus on similarities and differences that occur because of cultural differences. And there are a lot of those. Sometimes mental disorders look completely different from one culture to the other. Certain types of anxieties in the Western world affect women more. In other parts of the world, might affect men more. And sometimes, if you think about how people behave in groups, well, in the Western world, if you're in groups, oftentimes people work more slowly and they are less careful. But in a lot of Eastern culture, when people work in group, they try to do more and they're even more careful. Why does that happen? What are the social implications of that? That's something that a cross-cultural psychologist would focus on. Developmental psychology is also research usually, and it relates to how people grow. When you're born, you're just a little baby, you're tiny, and as you get older, you first of all get bigger. There are certain biological changes that occur. And there are a lot of emotional and mental changes that occur. You get smarter, you get more capable. And then when you get very old, some of those abilities start to decline. Why do those things happen? How do they happen? What's happening in the brain and the body, etc. That's something developmental psychologists might focus on. An educational psychologist focuses on how people learn. An educational psychologist is a researcher, and they're trying to figure out what's a good way to test people? What's a good way to get people to learn? Which ways do people not learn? You know, are teachers doing things that don't work? Are there activities that don't work? Are there activities that work for older people but not for young people? Are there certain types of wording that work for one group but not another group? Men but not women, African Americans but not whites. This is something that educational psychologists might be interested in. Put a little pin on educational psychology, because educational psychology is uh, just put a pin on it. I'll be right back. Now, environmental psychology uh, focuses on the relationship between the environments and human behavior. Things like, if I change what the room looks like, will people be more productive? Um, if I add more color, if I make it, more closed off, um, these things are things that people in environmental psychology might be interested in. If we go to to the natural environment, will people be, happier, etc. Experimental psychology, obviously, is experimental psychology. You're probably working for a college or you're working for a corporation, and you're doing experiments that focus on, you know, how people think, how people behave, perception, learning, motivation, just sort of in general. Forensic psychology has to do with the legal system. And so a forensic psychologist might be an expert witness in a courtroom. And, maybe the defendant has schizophrenia, and they'll ask a forensic psychologist to explain schizophrenia to the jury. Or there might be notes from a therapist, and they'll ask the forensic psychology to explain those notes to the jury. In some cases, forensic psychologists might work with police departments in trying to create like a profile for criminals based on the crimes. Is this criminal likely to be a man or a woman? Is the criminal likely to be an older person or a younger person? Things like that. Um, Health psychologist focuses on promoting health, preventing illness, things like getting people to exercise, to do diet and nutrition right, to change life choices, things like that. And likely they're going to work in hospitals, maybe gyms, maybe schools. Um, Human factor psychology focuses on the human capabilities and how to sort of maintain that, how to increase optimal performance. Um, they might work with athletes to come up with the best way to gain weight quickly, gain muscle weight, or lose weight quickly, things like that. They might work with uh, seeing how different leadership styles or genders affects, how well they perform, things like that. Personality psychology focuses on personality, measuring traits and seeing, to what degree personality is stagnant or fixed, and to what degree we can change it. Um, Positive psychology is a lot more like humanistic psychology, where you're focused on how to make people well and functional and happy. But unlike humanistic psychology, positive psychology is a lot more research based, and they are focused on neurotransmitters, how the body and the biology of the body affects functionality and things like that. Now, school psychology, remember when I told you put a check mark by educational psychology? I wanted to make the point that even though educational psychology and school psychology sound the same, they are not. They are very different. In school psychology, this is a person that works at a school and they work with students. So let's say Johnny can't, is not doing math homework anymore, and Johnny's having a real hard time in math. Well, the school psychologist is going to interview Johnny and is going to act a little bit like a therapist to figure out what's wrong with Johnny. How come Johnny can't learn? Is it a social reason, something happening at home? Is it something cognitive? Does Johnny have a learning disability? Is it something in the classroom? Is something in the classroom interfering with Johnny's ability to learn? And once they figure that out, how do we get Johnny then to learn? What can we put to, uh, you know, to help Johnny come back and start learning again? And if you're a school psychologist, no one is going to hire you as an educational psychologist, and vice versa. If you're an educational psychologist, no one is going to hire you as a school psychologist. And that is true for almost all of these other fields. Psychology is incredibly specific. And if you uh, do one, or if you go to school for one field, that doesn't always transfer to the other. And so it's in that way, it's not like being a business major. If you are a business major and then after you're done with your degree, you might decide that you want to be um, a manager, or you might want to work for a corporation. I don't know, doing research or in human resources, or there's wiggle room. But in psychology, the wiggle room is not very much, and the further you go into your education, the wiggle room gets less and less. um, and so one of the things I always tell my students is you need to know the job you want to do. If you want to be a psychologist, you got to figure out what is the job you want to do before you decide to pursue the educational field. All right. In social psychology, you're focusing in uh, groups, how groups think and feel, the beliefs of a group, and how those affect the individual. And in sports psychology, you're focusing on how different mental issues, psychological issues, emotional issues affect the performance of the athlete. For example, maybe an athlete got hurt on the field and now they're having a hard time getting back out there. Well, what can we use? What can we do to the athlete? What exercises can we give them? What psychological therapies can we give them to get them back in the field and back to their normal selves? All right, guys, this is chapter one. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Uh, have a wonderful rest of the week, and I'll hope to hear from you soon.